A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome one and all to the beautiful Hampstead Synagogue. My name is Richard Abramson. I'm the chairman of the synagogue, and as such, it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you on this terrific occasion. I have to say first the normal warning about an alarm. Should there be an alarm? We're not planning one. Exits are available to my right there, to my left, at the back, in 3 places. And please assemble as you exit, just to go out the street to the left and assemble near the corner there. We're here at a very exciting time for the Hampstead community. After nearly 30 years as our senior rabbi, Michael Harris is now living very happily in Israel. In January, we welcome a new young and dynamic rabbi, Rabbi Akiva Rosenblatt, who's here. Akiva, you're very welcome. And at the same time as we have a new rabbinical approach, we will be undertaking a major renovation of the building, which some of you know and have been in, next door, to form a community centre worthy of the synagogue that will be a resource both for our community and for young Jewish life in the neighbourhood. So, to the meeting this evening. The late Isaiah Berlin, philosopher who spent much of his life at Oxford University, was a long-standing member of this synagogue. And with his family's blessing and involvement, the Hampstead community established the annual Isaiah Berlin lecture in his memory. Our first lecturer back in 2003 was the former chief rabbi, the late Rabbi Lord Sachs. He was followed by a host of eminent speakers, including Sir Martin Gilbert, Archbishop Rowan Williams, Professor Simon Sharma, Gordon Brown, Baroness Brenda Hale, and most recently, Reid Hoffman. The idea is that the topics addressed by the speakers should be those which reflect on or build on the interests and expertise of Sir Isaiah, such as history, philosophy, and political theory. I'm now going to hand over to Zaki Cooper. Zaki has been the driving force in finding for us really the most remarkable speakers. Today is no exception. Over to you, Zaki, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Richard, and ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and a very warm welcome to you all to our most beautiful synagogue, in particular to first-time guests who are visiting us here this evening. It's a great pleasure to have you all here, and in particular David Miliband, to deliver this year's Isaiah Berlin lecture. Looking at the distinguished crowd we have here tonight and all the eminent journalists, you could be forgiven for thinking this was a Downing Street press conference. But it's a reflection of the interest in this, lecture number 23, since we started the series in honor of Isaiah Berlin back in 2003. David, of course, is well known to everyone here this evening. He's currently president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, where he leads their humanitarian relief operations in more than 40 war-affected countries. He was a familiar figure in British politics for many years as a number 10 advisor, MP for South Shields, and then Foreign Secretary in Gordon Brown's government for 3 years. We see David as a perfect fit to give the lecture here this evening for a number of reasons. First, Isaiah Berlin was a refugee, fleeing political turmoil and anti-Semitic threats with his family, first from revolutionary Russia, and then from Latvia to Britain in 1921. When he was just 11 years old. Similarly, David's parents fled to Britain from continental Europe during the Second World War and its aftermath, and it's no accident that he has ended up heading up the IRC. Second, both David and Isaiah had shared geographical links. Isaiah's family home was in Hampstead, not far from here, and he spent nearly his entire academic career at Oxford, starting as an undergraduate and keeping the link to Oxford for the next 70 years. David's schooling, in part, was also not far from here, and he also studied as an undergraduate at Oxford. And third and finally, David has an exceptional career in public service. He's been described by no less a figure than President Bill Clinton as one of the ablest, most creative public servants of our time. His career in this country and the US has given him a wide variety of experiences. In Berlin's language, that makes him more of a fox than a hedgehog. This was the idea espoused by Berlin in a landmark essay, which divides thinkers into two categories based on the ancient Greek saying, "The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing." So for these reasons and more, we're delighted that David will be giving the lecture this year. His subject is Britain in the New World Disorder. For sure, all of us know that the old assumptions about the international relations no longer hold, and that the one certainty is uncertainty. It's a chaotic and unstable world that we are bequeathing to the next generation, and in order to help us understand it and respond to it, there is no one better than tonight's speaker. So now it's my great pleasure to invite David Miliband to deliver this year's Isaiah Berlin Lecture.
Well, Zaki and Richard, thank you very much for that far too generous introduction. I'm really touched that so many of you should have come here tonight. There are representatives of many aspects of my North London upbringing here. I did, however, have to confess to the new rabbi that although my grandparents my grandmother sold hats and my grandfather made and sold leather wallets in a shop on the Lymington Road, so less than 5 minutes from here, I did have to confess to the rabbi that their and my synagogue attendance left far too much to be desired and should not be probed in any detail at all. But it's really touching for me that people I know and love from London who are examples to me in their professional service, in their public service, my colleagues from the civil service, from the International Rescue Committee, the fact that you've come here tonight is really, gives me an enormous sense of privilege. And it gives me a little bit of confidence as well, because it's a very daunting task to give a lecture in the name of Isaiah Berlin. He was, after all, the model of a 20th century intellectual. He was brilliant, worldly, inquiring, humble, charismatic, and determined. He sought a social function for theory, for ideas, for philosophy, as Zaki said. And he said he did that to, quote, assist men and women, assist men to understand themselves and thus operate in the open and not wildly in the dark. So his moral realism was courageous and unsentimental, which is a really unique combination. And it's a combination I would suggest that we need very much today. He was born in Riga in 1909. His family fled first to St. Petersburg to London, and his life, his early life, was shaped by revolution and war, the two great drivers of disorder in the first half of the 20th century. For the second half of his life, a long half, for the second half plus of his life, based in Oxford, the background music was much more tranquil. It was provided by the emergence of the West, not a geographic concept, but a political one, as a coherent and eventually victorious force that prevailed in the Cold War and defined international relations at the end of the 20th century. Now, these two halves of Berlin's life were separated by his diplomatic posting to New York in 1940 on behalf of the British government. He arrived 2 months before Roosevelt's re-election. The war seemed to many Americans far away. and the idea of the West was not concrete at all. Roosevelt was in deadly combat with the first incarnation of the America First movement. Some of you may have read about a recent incarnation. It took Pearl Harbor in 1941 to prompt a decisive turn. So tonight, I'm going to reflect on the twin themes of global disorder and the fate of the West, not as they affected Berlin, but as they affect us. And here's what strikes me. In Berlin's lifetime, it was the unity of the political West that saved the world from disorder, first from fascism and then from communism. Britain was central both to the definition of the West and the fight against disaster. Today, however, it's the other way round. Disorder in the world, and there is a lot of it as I will describe, is exacerbated by the disunity of the West. Again, Britain is affected by both, and although our agency is much more limited, the way we play our cards is going to affect our future very significantly. Berlin would have told us that there are no historical inevitabilities. And those of you who've said to me tonight already, where's the hope? The hope is that there are no historical inevitabilities. Decline is not a destiny. The future is a contest over values and interests that we have to identify and then defend. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. Here's my take on where we're at in 3 points. First, there's an extraordinary level of global disorder today and reaction to it, backlash against it. But I don't think we should kid ourselves that the world is headed for some kind of de-globalization. Instead, the combination of growing global risks, fragmenting global politics, and the global digital revolution are creating a more anarchic form of what I would call might makes right globalization. No one country is in charge. The world is, quote unquote, multi-aligned. Second, the old idea of the West, which I'll describe, is not coming back. And one key reason is that the old America is not coming back. The Trump administration is in part a symptom of the way the world has changed, but it also needs to be recognized, in my view, for its genuinely revolutionary character. It's a key driver both of division within the West and the new global disorder. Prime Minister Keir Starmer said after tariffs were imposed in April, quote, "The world as we knew it has gone." I think he was and is right. So third, for countries like ours, the challenge is not to build a single global order, a new world order, but instead to contribute to what the historian Adam Tooze calls, quote unquote, world ordering. This means multiple coalitions of the willing that push back against impunity. For Britain, our interests are aligned with the rest of Europe, but our cooperation is sabotaged by Brexit, and we need to address that. But we also need to engage with the world beyond Europe, including in the UN Security Council, where I think our privileged position will come under siege unless we're a voice for reform of the UN system. So that's what I'm going to set out tonight. Before going into the present, though, I want to talk about a small connection to the very last days of Isaiah Berlin's life. A connection that is at once personal to me, but vicarious. Here's the story. In 1997, October 1997, Prospect magazine published an interview with Sir Isaiah Berlin. It was actually an extract from an interview that he'd done 5 years earlier. And my original speech text said, "But I didn't realize it at the time." In fact, when I went back to check, Prospect didn't reveal that the interview had been done 5 years earlier. So it wasn't all my fault. Among other things, Berlin argued that the victory of the West in the Cold War against the Soviet Union meant the end of the politics of the left The end of the Cold War meant the end of the politics of the left, said Sir Isaiah. My job at the time was to be head of the policy unit in Downing Street. And the spirit, some of you I think are just about old enough to remember, the spirit at the time was one of glad, confident mourning. So I drafted a letter for the Prime Minister to write to Sir Isaiah Berlin. The letter suggested that, in fact, the end of the Soviet model was a liberation for the left, allowing its values to flourish without the taint of Soviet communism. Now, Tony Blair humored me in these forays because he believed strongly that the battle of ideas mattered a lot. He believed the battle of ideas mattered in politics more than most people in politics realized. And he was enthusiastic to meet Isaiah Berlin because he was going through his communitarian phase. He talked about social-ism. That was his version of socialism. And he asked in the letter to meet Sir Isaiah Berlin. I was told by Peter, who's going to speak later, that this was the last letter that Sir Isaiah received before he died. And he read it, but sadly died before replying to it, still less having the meeting. But for our purposes tonight, the striking thing is not actually what Sir Isaiah Berlin said about the Cold War meaning the end of the left, which Tony questioned in his letter. Instead, it's this paradox, which has become clearer and clearer since Berlin's death. Victory in the Cold War seems to have been a victory from which the West, not the left, would never recover. That is what we're living with today, and that's what I'm going to try and explore tonight. So, let's return to the present. What will the world record about 2025? It won't all be bad. It looks like Arsenal are going to win the league. Nuclear fusion has achieved a significant breakthrough. China has installed 250 gigawatts of solar power in the first half of this year alone, twice as much as the rest of the world combined. There's a Gaza ceasefire of sorts. US capital investment in artificial intelligence has reached a staggering $500 billion this year already. But in a world with more resources to do more good than at any time in human history, the landscape is charred with damage. 60 conflicts around the world. The World Bank uprating the number of people estimated to be living on less than $3 a day to 830 million. The Varieties of Democracy project at the University of Gothenburg recording that there are now more autocracies in the 195 countries in the world than there are democracies, the first time in 20 years. The United Nations High Commission on Refugees says there are 125 million refugees. There have been 2 famines this year and 6 countries with catastrophic levels of food insecurity. Carbon emissions have breached last year's record, with the target of limiting the rise in global average temperatures to 1.5 degrees over the historic pre-industrial age average to have been a target that's been torched. And alongside that very real damage, there's danger. Climate change, AI, pandemics, the nuclear arms race all run the risk of crossing dangerous tipping points. The quote-unquote runaway world that Tony Giddens feared in his 1999 Reith lectures has come closer. And so the first question we have to address is, how did this happen? How do we move from a situation where at the end of the Cold War in 1990, democracy was on the march, notably in Latin America and Africa, regulated markets and free trade were dominant, the Kyoto Protocol was signed, multilateral institutions were growing in importance, human rights was gaining ground after the disasters of Rwanda and former Yugoslavia. How did it happen? Undoubtedly, policy mistakes at home and abroad spurred inequality, instability, loss of confidence. But my thesis is that the changes that have ruptured the global order are actually more structural than contingent policy mistakes suggest. and they're in three categories. First, as a consequence of a more connected world, global risks have risen exponentially and far outstripped the ability of global institutions to manage them. The climate crisis, the imbalances of the global economy, the refugee crisis. In each case, international cooperation is too weak to meet the challenges. Now, I know that bloat and power in international institutions have been blamed. But my argument is that it's the weakness, not the overweening strength of these international institutions that's been exposed by these problems. Second, while globalization is not new, a hyper-connected world is. And it's emerged without anyone in charge. It's the second big change. Chinese economic growth is well known. India has transformed itself. But the 10 BRICS countries, originally Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they account now for 1/3 of global gross domestic product and 50% of the global population. Countries like the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Indonesia have achieved a quantum shift in their economic development and are putting their power to geopolitical use. Now, here's the interesting thing for us. America's share of global GDP, gross domestic product, has not changed in 30 years. 30 years ago, America accounted for 25% of global gross domestic product. Today, it's still 25%. But the rest of the group of 7 leading industrialized economies, including the UK, have seen our share fall from 42% to 18%. So more than halved. And political power has moved with this economic shift. It's not as simple as East is rising, West is falling, but that is part of the story. Sometimes it's called a multipolar world. And Secretary Rubio talks about a multipolar world. But I don't think that's right. What I see is something much more fluid, much more transactional, a world of multiple alignments, not a world of fixed blocks. And there's a quite brilliant Indian opposition politician called Shashi Tharoor, who was previously at the United Nations. And in 2006, he coined this idea of a multi-aligned world, not just a multipolar world. And I want you to hold on to that. Because I see this multi-aligned world in my work every day. If you go to any conflict zone, which in the vast majority of cases are called, quote unquote, civil wars, they're very uncivil, you find competing parties are backed from outside. In Sudan, the largest humanitarian crisis ever, 30 million people are in humanitarian need. I was there in September. Over a dozen countries are actively supporting the different sides in the conflict. All 10 neighbors of Sudan are backing one side or the other. So this is not the quote-unquote leaderless world. It's a world of many leaders, and it suffers the feature that's known as the Kindleberger trap, after an American economist called Charles Kindleberger. There's a power vacuum where critical global public goods, like open markets, like security, are not provided by anyone. So those are the first 2 big changes. The third change is accelerating the first 2, and that's obviously the technological revolution. Because the shift from an industrial age to a digital age has ripped up the social, economic, and political contract all over the world. For all that there's a debate about how trade has cost jobs, the truth is, it's technological change that has been by far the biggest contributor to the deindustrialization of previously industrialized societies. The standoff between the US and China over semiconductors and rare earth minerals shows how geopolitics and geoeconomics collide with each other. And there's a massive knock-on effect from this tech shock into politics. And that's important because politics is the way we govern ourselves. In the US, you saw the fusion of tech power and political power at the inauguration. But the impact of this digital revolution is much bigger than the replacement of one group of industrial tycoons with a group of tech bros. There's a book by an Italian writer called Giovanni Di Empoli that I really recommend, The Hour of the Predator. And he covers the way technology has transformed politics. And he uses this very striking metaphor, quote, "The fate of our democracies is being played out increasingly in a sort of digital Somalia," you could say digital Sudan, "a bankrupt state the size of the planet at the mercy of the overlords of online warfare and their militias." So the challenge for open societies is absolutely fundamental, because we're not going to go back into an age when capital flows or refugee flows or even trade flows are reversed. We're not going into de-globalization. We're not going into a world where the technological revolution is going to go into reverse. We've got to look for what I would call stabilizing buoys in this stormy sea. How do we bring some stability to this disorder? And that brings us to this question of the quote-unquote West, which I want to talk about now. The origins of this political idea of the West was defined by someone who was the German foreign minister just before I was the UK foreign secretary, a man called Joschka Fischer, who was a Green Party politician. And he defined the birth certificate of the West as the Atlantic Charter that was signed by Churchill and Roosevelt in Newfoundland in December 1941. Its central tenets are worth thinking about today, because that Atlantic Charter said that above all, the world had to learn the lessons of the previous age of disorder, the interwar period. And above all, that should mean that nations should be able to define their own futures and not be subjugated by the powerful. And that was a bitter pill for Churchill to swallow because of his belief in the British Empire. That trade should be open and free, not coerced. That human rights should be meaningful and equal, and that the rule of law, not the rule of the jungle, should govern international affairs. Those ideas found rhetorical force in a remarkable speech by President Truman, who'd just taken over after Roosevelt's death at the time of the San Francisco conference that founded the United Nations in 1945. He said, quote, "We must once and for all prove by our acts conclusively that right has might." I did not misread that. Right has might was his argument. And when you hear people talk about a liberal international order, I want you to think of this. The agreements at the time of the foundation of the United Nations and over the next 5 or 6 years, the Refugee Convention was in 1951. These agreements were, quote unquote, liberal in the sense that they put the rights of people alongside the rights of states for the first time in human history. They were international in the sense that they were signed by all countries, communist, capitalist, dictatorships, democracies, they all signed up. And they constituted a quote-unquote order because of the institutions established to forge compromise to achieve the implementation of these goals. That's how you get the phrase liberal international order. And by the end of the Cold War in 1990, these ideas seemed hegemonic. They were utterly dominant. There's a brilliant Bulgarian political scientist called Ivan Krastev, and he said that the Western model, liberal democracy at home, free markets abroad, regulated markets abroad, was quote-unquote presumptively canonical. In other words, they were the order of the day. Well, they're not the order of the day now. It's not just that President Xi Jinping of China claims that we're living through the inevitable victory of the East over the West, nor that we have lectures from President Putin about how liberalism is quote-unquote obsolete. More important is the facts of democracy in retreat, which I've set out, mercantilism on the rise, multilateral institutions weak and weakening, globalist as an epithet in countries that shaped and benefited from globalization. And I really urge you to notice that the Vice President of the United States, echoed by many on his side of politics, says, quote, "There is something about Western liberalism that seems almost suicidal or socially, or at least socially parasitic," unquote. And this is where the character, the revolutionary character of the Trump administration comes in and has to be understood. I really don't agree with those who say that there's no ideology, nor do I think that should be any comfort in the idea that the divisions that exist within the coalition that elected President Trump are necessarily fatal to its prospects. The story and the revolutionary character begins with a speech that President Trump made in Warsaw in 2017, in his first term. Quote, "With our minds, our wills, and our souls." That's what they set out to change. The challenge is to the core idea of what the West means, rewriting the Atlantic Charter. Far from lauding the checks and balances of liberal democracy, the commitments to minority rights and human rights, the promotion of regulated trade, the belief in multilateral international organizations, these are said not to be the strength of the West, but actually the root of the decline of the West. And remember, or note, that argument is also Putin's argument. Where China and Russia are anti-West, and India and Brazil are non-West, the movement led by President Trump and his allies is seeking to redefine the West from within. It exalts singular power as a replacement for pluralism that Berlin lauded. It promotes soil and roots in place of credo, heritage in place of ideals in defining a nation. It values national sovereignty in place of international organizations rather than as a foundation of them. It embraces majority fiat and executive rule in place of minority rights and deliberative democracy. And by the way, that movement is far more interested in internal politics in Germany and the UK than it is in internal politics in China or Russia. On foreign policy, I think it's wrong to see the American administration as quote-unquote isolationist, though there is an element of that in their movement. It's certainly unilateralist in that it acts independently. It embraces bilateralism, in other words, singular relations between countries, and it's deeply suspicious of multilateralism. There's a scholar called Celia Berlin of the European Council on Foreign Relations, and Mark, the director, is here. She wrote a very interesting paper. She said, President Trump's foreign policy has a clear through line. It's his domestic agenda exported. Europe is seen in some quarters as an extension of MAGA's political opponents at home. And once again, there's a link back to Isaiah Berlin, because he said this first. He said, nationalism, quote, transforms inward moral conflicts into external enemies. Isn't that what we're seeing today? These enemies can be seen in divisions within the liberal democratic world on Russia, climate, global health, Greenland, international development, international law, international institutions, nuclear testing. On these issues, the West is riven. It's actually divided on Gaza as well. And watch out on China. I was in Beijing in October. There are serious dangers that we have to worry about in a confrontation between China and America. But Europeans also need to watch the dangers if China and America come to agreement. As an excellent paper from the Robert Schuman Center in Brussels put it, there's a pincer facing Europe, with the US an increasingly extractive superpower, extracting from its alliances, and China a dependency superpower, creating dependency. And the AI revolution is only going to increase, should only increase our European fear of being squeezed. The US on its own constitutes 75% of all AI capital expenditure at the moment. Chinese investment takes the figure to 85%. And this all leaves countries like Britain, or the country that we care about, Britain, facing double jeopardy. There's domestic jeopardy and international jeopardy. I'm not going to rehearse the mistakes that we've made over the last 15 years. Austerity, Brexit, COVID, then the Russian invasion of Ukraine, making a shift in foreign policy towards Asia, which had been announced, seemed naive. There's a primary task of domestic revitalization and resilience. And I really want to say this to you, not just as a proud British person, but as someone who lives in New York, but comes back to the UK a lot. We have a lot to build on, from science to finance to creative industries to the law to the National Health Service. The BBC, this shouldn't be a controversial statement, the BBC is a great British national strength. And if you want to be cheered up, the BBC is the most trusted US source of news, or source of news for US audiences, apart from the Weather Channel. So the BBC, and the BBC of course does weather as well, and I'm sure its weather forecasts are as accurate, but the BBC is a global asset for Britain. We should never forget it. But I'm going to focus on the international front, because what we do abroad affects what we can do at home. And our international position has been weakened. We don't have the finance of Saudi Arabia, the European links of Germany, the demography of Indonesia or India, or the regional sway of Turkey. We're out of the EU, America is tough and transactional, the UN system is in retreat. And it seems to me we need to answer 3 questions as we come to terms with the new global disorder. Those questions are about, first, whether the Western alliance that I described earlier can be remade in its old image. And the short answer to that is no, it can't. I don't know how many people here remember, I'd be surprised if it's more than 10 of you, that a revised Atlantic Charter was issued by President Biden and Prime Minister Sunak in 2022. I'd be surprised if more than 10 people can remember that happening. Now, you can dismiss that effort as doomed to fail. But I would say to you that the world is stacked against the idea of a bloc coming together in the way that it used to. Berlin would have called this the price of pluralism, the world's inescapable multitude of purposes that defined Isaiah Berlin's thinking. And what's more, I guarantee you, America is not going to play the role of the benevolent hegemon again. The experience of the first half of the 20th century, in which generations of Americans fought in Europe, forged common bonds, and learned the lessons of history, is not coming back. We need to think about what the President of the US Council on Foreign Relations calls coalitions of the like-minded, which together would constitute a network of plurilateral, more jargon, relationships. And I think this is a call out to countries like Britain to be agile and entrepreneurial in defense of their values and interests. The historian Adam Tooze, who I mentioned earlier, he says, "This is not a moment for soothing bedtime stories, but to summon our wits to survive." So the second question then is about what we stand for. Does this multi-aligned world mean we stand for nothing, have no fixed values or orientation to the world around us, and are just reduced to where we can find leverage with any country around the world? My answer to that is also no, strong no. I think the central challenge facing the world today goes to the heart of the idea of the West, not the structure of it. It's the challenge of impunity, the exercise of power without accountability. And this goes to the heart of Isaiah Berlin's work. I'm not a Berlin scholar, but I studied him 35 years ago, and I did some reading for this lecture. He argued that the politics was the art of preventing cruelty, not achieving perfection. He taught that liberty is not secure when power is unchecked. Because human values are plural and in tension, so political institutions that represent multiple viewpoints and counteract arbitrary power are a strength, not a weakness. The fact that they make the exercise of political power cumbersome is exactly the point. But wherever you look today, from the invasion of Ukraine to the power of big tech, to abuse meted out to civilians in war zones, the abuse of power for those with power is growing, not receding. That's why I talk about an age of impunity and the need to build countervailing power against it, and chair the advisory board of something called the Atlas of Impunity that ranks every country in the world on 5 different dimensions of impunity. This battle against impunity puts Britain on the right side of the biggest and most difficult political arguments in foreign policy. We're a medium-sized country that relies on rules, playing by them, not just incanting them, to sustain our interests. But for that, we need alliances, and this leads to the third question. If we're clear about what we stand for, who do we stand with? On this, I think the Starmer administration has shown the right instincts. It wants to get closer to Europe. It stays strong on Ukraine. It's trying to keep in check the economic threats from the United States while sustaining intelligence and security relationships, which are vital. It's forging a trade agreement with India, joining the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Trade, and it's reaching out to ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries. The issue is not whether the instincts are right. The issue is one of policy dosage and impact. In other words, how much welly are they putting behind the things that they really believe in? In crude terms, will the moves that have been made so far make an impact in this Parliament? I want to give you one example. The trade agreement that constitutes a reset, so-called, with Europe is worth £9 billion by 2040. That may sound like a lot of money, but we are already a £3 trillion economy. So a £9 billion improvement will be completely lost in the roundings, the fiscal roundings. The European agenda for Britain has to go wider than our relationship with the European Union, not least because the EU needs to work with non-members. Countries like the UK, Norway, Switzerland, Ukraine one day, hopefully, Turkey. There are going to be new institutional arrangements, but I want to dwell for a moment on this question of the UK's relationship with the EU post-Brexit. The government has an agenda: veterinary standards, energy, youth mobility, defence. But the negotiating path is tricky. And and I tell you this, if I know anything about EU negotiations, it's that they are utterly draining of energy and goodwill unless they're given political momentum. And meanwhile, as we seek political momentum, the daily damage of Brexit is mounting. And I just want to give you an example which shocked me. The picture on goods trade, we call ourselves a trading nation, but the picture on goods trade is terrifying. The combined value of imports and exports as a share of GDP for Britain rose from 30% in 1975 when we joined the EU to 67% last year. So 2/3 of GDP is tied up with trade. But we're suffering from what Anton Spisak, he's here tonight, of the Centre for European Reform, calls the most severe trade stagnation in a generation. By the end of 2024, goods exports were 20% below their 2019 level. And as Anton says, this is a structural problem, because we've gone from 5% a year growth in trade volumes until 2008, 75 to 2008, to 2% a year, and now trade volumes are flat. If you look at the fall in goods exports, it's been draining 1% of gross domestic product. That's £30 billion a year, every year. I want to give you an example of what we can do about it. I know there's a big argument about the customs union, which is said to be rejoining the customs union is said to be worth 0.5 to 1% of GDP, so 15 to 30 billion pounds a year. And the government has ruled out joining the customs union in its manifesto. But a commitment to just align our regulatory standards for manufactured goods alone has been estimated by Frontier Economics to be worth 1 to 1.5% of GDP, so more. Product testing, labeling, conformity assessment barriers would be removed. And that was not ruled out in the Labour manifesto. We just can't afford to stand still on that economic relationship. But of course, it needs the EU to engage and compromise. And the recent agreement with Switzerland, on the one hand, is good news, because it shows the EU will have bespoke arrangements with other countries. On the other hand, the EU is determined not to compromise that agreement with Switzerland before the Swiss have a referendum to put it through. So what do? We have to look outside the economic area to inject political momentum into the economic relationship. And I just want to run through some quick examples. There's something called the European Defence Mechanism that's been proposed. That's an 800 billion euro system of long-dated bonds to pay for increases in defence spending. One way to mitigate the fiscal pain of increased defence spending is for the UK to be all in on this idea. It would issue long-dated bonds to pay for increased defence spending, with a number of proposals circulating that sit in parallel to the procurement initiative that's getting a lot of attention at the moment, but which is worth only 150 billion euros, and which at the moment we're in danger of missing out on in the first round of negotiations that are due to end by November. If we don't finish by November, we're out of the first round of procurement. This European defence mechanism would be intergovernmental, so it wouldn't be an EU institution, and it would be open to non-members like the UK and Norway, and eventually Ukraine. It wouldn't be vulnerable to vetoes by countries like Hungary, which is obviously a worry in respect of the defence relationship. Its structure as effectively a rearmament bank would allow debt to stay off national balance sheets until equipment is purchased. And the danger of this proposal is that it's put in the too difficult box, when in fact it should be in the essential box. Another area is close to my heart is humanitarian aid. The UK used to be a superpower in the aid arena. It no longer is. But the EU is the biggest aid provider in the world. In my view, we should be offering to merge part of our overseas aid budget with what the Europeans are doing to have bigger effect together. Of course, I could talk about migration. It deserves its own lecture, distinguishing immigration from asylum, addressing integration, not just entry, and also addressing national and international responsibilities. Just remember, when we were members of the EU, we had the right to deport people who arrived in a small boat from France back to the country from which they came and first landed in Europe. I run a humanitarian organization, it was said at the beginning. An orderly, fair, and speedy migration set of rules and decisions are actually in the interests of refugees as well as in the interests of host populations. But a sustainable solution is going to need European cooperation. Just in the interest of time, I want to say in brief, when we think about challenges like AI, where if we're not careful, if we're not an artificial intelligence maker, we're going to end up as a taker of other people's decisions, we've got to recognize that when it comes to finding sufficient scientific, research, technological scale, we're better off doing it with the other countries in Europe than separately. We're actually in the UK ahead of the EU in certain facets of the AI race, not least because some of their regulation is overly burdensome. But we share a need to build European capability if we're not to be vulnerable clients of the two emerging superpowers that are coming through. It's also worth noting, when it comes to the fundamental economic security issue of rare earth minerals, which are absolutely vital in defense and energy, and which the Chinese have been working on for over 30 years, there's massive EU-UK shared interest in cooperation. The EU is actually more ambitious and more muscular in its approach to these rare earths than we are. And the danger for the UK is that we get left behind. So this is all to say, if we recognize the argument for closer links between our closest, not just geographic neighbors, but also political and values neighbors in the rest of Europe, we've got to inject some political momentum into what otherwise will become a stale set of negotiations. I just want to finish by saying something that goes beyond the European continent, because obviously the multi-aligned world means that we need alliances beyond Europe, as well as, not just instead of, alliances in Europe. And there's a wide range of options for international cooperation. I just want to say a word about our position in the UN system, in the United Nations system. I know the UN gets a lot of flack, but the UN is only as strong as the member states make it. For Britain, it's in our interests that the UN be stronger, not weaker. And equally important, I honestly believe our privileged position as one of only 5 veto-holding countries will come under huge strain unless we show ourselves to be reformers. Now, the Prime Minister has recommitted the UK to the long-standing position that India should be a member of the Security Council. That's fine, but it's a very long shot. And more veto-wielding countries are hardly going to make the UN work more efficiently and effectively. Here are the kind of ideas that I think are tests being set for us by countries around the world about new coalitions for global progress. 3 of them, quickly. Consistent with tackling impunity, I think we should support the suspension of the veto in the UN Security Council in cases of mass atrocity. France has already proposed this. 120 countries support it. The humanitarian nightmares in Syria, Gaza, Ukraine, all blighted by Russian and American use of the veto, have contributed to the castration of the Security Council as the preeminent problem-solving forum on matters of war and peace. It can't solve the diplomacy. I'm saying that for dealing with the mass atrocities, you have to suspend the veto, and 120 countries support it. Consistent with the determination to get appropriate independence for UN officials, we should support the idea that the Secretary General of the UN should be a one-term, 7-year appointment. The worst thing is when people get into office, they spend their time running for re-election. We actually need an independent, someone with the independence that comes from knowing that you've got one term in office. And remember, there's a new Secretary General coming within the next year. And consistent with the commitment to get the best people into the right jobs, we should support killing off the convention that certain jobs are reserved for certain countries. The UK-nominated Emergency Response Coordinator, Tom Fletcher, is doing a fantastic job. He's in Sudan today. Yesterday he was in Sudan. But we need a system where all appointments are merit-based, not nationally based. None of these ideas are a silver bullet, but they would show a Britain ready to recognize that the world order is being rebalanced and that impunity needs countervailing power if it's to be addressed. So, let me move to a conclusion. The argument of this lecture has been that far from globalization going away, globalization is going to crowd in on us. This was true of Isaiah Berlin's life in its own form, and it's true for us today. We need to, I think, or we can and should, take inspiration from his ideas and his imagination. His commitment to pluralism was not the abandonment of principle, but the making of principle. He rejected the false choice between negative and positive liberty. Flourishing societies offer their citizens freedom from oppression and support to enjoy that freedom. This is what he said. Negative liberty, in other words, freedom from oppression, is twisted when I'm told that liberty must be equal for the tiger and for the sheep, and that this cannot be avoided even if it enables the former to eat the latter. He also rejected, and it feels appropriate to say this, especially appropriate, he rejected the false choice of being either rooted or cosmopolitan, of being from somewhere or everywhere, because he was very clearly British, but also worldly. He said, quote, "I'm a Jew in England, a Russian in Berlin, a liberal among ideologues." Now, nearly 80 years ago, George Kennan ended his famous long telegram from Moscow by saying the greatest danger was not the nuclear arms race, it was that we allow ourselves to become like those with whom we are competing. Today, the task is not to seek to restore lost dominance, but instead to recover moral clarity and political vision of who we are and what we stand for. As liberal societies and their politicians are tempted down a path that rejects pluralism, harasses opponents, demonizes refugees, declares emergencies, suborns the media, instrumentalizes the judicial system, all of them features of the Soviet system that the Cold War was fought to defeat. This would surely be the ultimate role reversal in the world today, one that Berlin would have fought with courage and with conviction, and one that we need to fight and win at all costs. Thank you very much indeed.
We'd like to take questions now. There is a roving mic going round. When you ask questions, could you please stand up and speak clearly with the mic? And could you give your name, please? Right. Question over here. Nina, are you able to get over here? Gentleman in the 5th row.
Hi, David. Thank you for that. Raphael Baird from The Guardian. a fascinating lecture. The strong theme throughout this tension between nation states, national power, sovereignty, multinational, international institutions, not necessarily being able to reconstruct something that was founded in the past. I'd be interested to hear you reflect a little bit on what that means actually for the future of the EU itself, internally in the European project, especially if we might have, a far-right president in France within 3 years' time.
It's a good question. I think it's going to be a different EU. It's going to be what was called in the 1990s a variable geometry EU. It's going to do things in different configurations, and it's going to do things with members of the EU, some members of the EU, non-members of the EU. And I don't know exactly how that's going to come about. Actually, President Macron, as you know, he has this 4 rings of cooperation with just a subset of countries who are doing everything together in the middle. But I think it's going to be much more fluid. Now, the question for the European Union is, what does it keep as core and non-negotiable? And I don't know, 3 years is a long time in politics before the next French election, 2.5 years away. But I think that 2 things. One, especially from the UK, but not only, it's been a sport to write the obituaries of the European Union since the 1950s, and I think we shouldn't do that. There's so much vested there that I think would be unwise. As a stance, I think don't underestimate the commitment. But secondly, when challenged by crisis, it's shown far more flexibility than anyone would ever have predicted. And I think the critical thing for us is whether or not we can harness that sense of crisis yielding flexibility in a way that doesn't relitigate old issues, but actually tries to address some of the new ones. And I honestly think that on the foreign policy front, it could actually be a proving ground for the UK and the EU to do more together that built the trust. And to be fair to the previous government and to the current government, what's happening on Ukraine is a very good example of that. You've now got a situation where the EU is not just funding, but engaging with NATO in a completely new way in defense of Ukraine, because it's seen as a defense of Europe itself. And I think we should seek to build on that.
Yes, the gentleman over there. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you. Mr. Miliband, my name is Dr. Peter Karpati. I don't write in newspapers, I just read them. You mentioned how internal disagreements become external enemies. Don't you think that before Britain thinks about its new role in the international stage, we need to kind of define what we as a nation stand for inside of the nation?
I tell you what I really think. I don't think we can afford to take a break from international engagement because things are moving fast. And of course there is work of vital domestic revitalization, reconstruction, re-engagement. But I don't think we can afford to absent ourselves from what's happening internationally because it's going to crowd in. And we don't have that option. Now, I also think there's still a lot that unites us here. And so there's a danger of sort of narcissism of small differences, but we have to defend the big differences. And my instinct is that done right, the international element of this and the domestic element of this can go together rather than be seen as sequential. And I don't think we have the luxury of seeing them as sequential. So I hope that's an answer. I hope that answers your question.
Hi, David. Robert Peston. It was a brilliant lecture, by the way, so thanks for that. We won't be able to achieve or participate in any of the sort of multi-aligned progress that you advocate if the rise of nationalism here and across a sort of failing West continues. Some of it's associated with political extremism, but not all of it. So how does one make the case for the kind of pluralism and internationalism that we desperately need if we're not going to descend into even whether it's, social, environmental, technological chaos.
So there's this phrase that is used a lot in America. I don't know if it's used here so much, but it's used especially in respect of board meetings. Show, don't tell. And I think show, don't tell applies a lot to the questions that you raise, that do it rather than talk about why it would be good to do it. But here's the thing. As the Biden administration found to its cost, just showing on its own is not enough. You've got to show and tell. You've got to show but then tell, And you've got to, you see, I think successful governments are a cause. They're a cause based on a diagnosis of what's wrong and an argument about what needs to be done to put them right. But you've got to show. And so I think you can't afford to show, not tell, but you've got to, you can't afford, you've got to deliver. And it's the delivery deficit that I think is the massive thing that needs to be addressed in the advanced industrialized societies. One of the things that I didn't have time to say here, if pre-2008 growth rates had carried on in the UK, I don't know why I'm telling you this, I'm sure you know this, you probably told me this, but £16,000 per person richer than we are now if we'd carried on pre-2008 levels of economic growth. So it's a delivery challenge that means summoning people to a cause, I think.
There's a question over here, and then
Sorry.
Jerry. This gentleman first, and then this gentleman.
Thank you, Rafi Addlestone. You talked about sort of cascading problems, climate, refugees, trade. And I think there's a sort of sense today that all those things are making politics much more difficult. I think Fraser Nelson wrote yesterday in the Times, and Sam Freeman and people talk about sort of failure at the heart of government, of the capacity and capability of politicians to be able to grip these challenges. Do you agree with that? And to what degree is the structural challenge you talk about solvable through a better way of doing politics?
Through?
Doing politics better.
I think that there's two questions there. One is about how politics has changed since I was in politics, and the second is about how the state or government has changed. It's interesting that you said, I don't want to misquote you, but you said something like, politicians can do things for themselves or show that they can get things done. And the truth is you need both. I think that, first of all, in respect of how politics has changed, performance in my day meant how did you do on the Today programme or on Robert Peston's programme or in the House of Commons. It didn't mean how good were you at typing out your tweets or doing on social media. And so I think there's a change in performance, but here's something that my friend Douglas Alexander says this, and I think he's really onto something. In the Reagan years, Reagan said, if you're explaining, you're losing. And what Douglas says is, that's wrong now. If you're not explaining, you're not in the game. So I don't, all to say that I think that as successful politicians show, you can master the narrative as long as various conditions are met. Above all, that what you say and what you do are aligned with each other. I think that's really important. And then you've got to find new ways of spelling it out. Now, in terms of the way government works, I'm an optimist about that, actually. I think that big bureaucracies, first of all, want to do what the top of the department or organization wants them to do. And the real task of the leadership is to make sure that the system is not getting in the way of the entrepreneurialism and the agility that's necessary to get things done. I'm sort of seeing that on a microcosm in my own organization. We've lost $400 million of US government funding in the last 8 months. And that's terrible, in that 2 million clients, including 300,000 kids in Afghanistan, have lost their education. Boys and girls have lost their education. So we've lost $400 million of US government funding out of $1.5 billion. So we built ourselves up from being a $500 million organization 10 years ago to being a $1.5 billion organization. We're now down to $1.1 billion, which is actually still quite a lot. We're still twice as big as we were 10 years ago. But here's the interesting thing. We've not just cut programs, we've had to cut our systems, our regional systems, our global systems, even some of our local systems. And there is a way in which we're getting out of our own way, having done that. We've done that with, I think, a real sense of agility and entrepreneurialism and a just ceaseless focus on what's best for the client that we're trying to solve. The client needs people in place, it needs IT in place, it needs consistency, it needs quality programming, it needs innovation. But we're certainly slimmer, and I think there's a chance we may end up having got out of our own way. And so it worries me when I hear that there are 100,000 more civil servants than there were before Brexit. Because there's a danger that the systems get in their own way. It's also the case, let's be honest, that if the politicians are changing every year, or in some departments every 6 months, you can't build up the sense of consistency and trust and cohesion. So I think that's really important as well.
Gentleman here.
Jerry Lewis from Israel Radio. First of all, may I preface my question by just saying you've given us tonight a masterclass and shows how much we miss the politics that you put forward. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Jay.
Can I ask you,
But?
based on the last answer, how the drift, maybe the move to the right, which we've seen in America, seen in Europe, the cuts, for example, to the Voice of America, affecting your organisation, how's that going to impact on a world that desperately needs more help rather than less help? And second of all, may I be allowed to ask, having seen a ceasefire of sorts imposed on Gaza with the strange politics that Israel is suffering at the moment, how do you see the future peace prospects? Thank you.
Well, I mean, Jerry, you told me beforehand you'd covered the lobby for 40 years, which is a remarkable achievement. So, and I know from our many engagements that you want to know what the politicians are saying and you report it faithfully, which is a big thing. On the first, Fareed Zakaria wrote a book 20 years ago called The Post-American World, which didn't mean that there wasn't an America, but he talked about the rise of the rest. And quite a lot of that is happening. And I think that the way I would put it is that for all of its mistakes, America has been an anchor of the global system. And what's happened is the anchor has been pulled up. And in stormy seas, when the anchor's pulled up, the passengers get seasick. I mean, that's what's happening in the short term. Now, there's adjustment going on, but this Kindleberger point that the global public goods are missing because there isn't the anchor, there isn't the stabilizing buoy, is very serious. And I think it would be wrong to just say, oh, it'll work out. I mean, that's the soothing bedtime story, because although American policy mistakes over the last 80 years have caused some disorder, the net benefit of that anchoring role has been enormous. And I don't think that it's going to be replaced anytime soon. And so I think you asked me what's the effect. I think it's going to be to cause more rockiness in the boat, in the global boat. I think that's just inevitable. I don't think it's fair to ask me to, at 9:10 on a Sunday night, what's the future of the Middle East. All I can say, we've got 55 people working for the International Rescue Committee in Gaza, 55 Palestinians. Thank God the hostages have been released. Those 55 humanitarian aid workers who we've recruited tell me a deeply sobering story about daily life, but also medium-term prospects. And I think the fairest thing to say is I'm very worried. I don't want to, you better ask another question so we don't end on this note, but I think it's not a viable equilibrium at the moment. And I'm not going to comment on the Israeli government, but just what I do meetings with our teams and our people. It's a ceasefire of sorts, and so there's some more room to breathe, but it's a very, very challenging situation on the ground for them to feed their own families, never mind sustain the people that who are actually the clients.
Lady over there, Iris. Hi, my name is Iris Margulis. I'm a member here of Hampstead Synagogue. Thanks so much for your lecture. I'm also a former PPE student, so kind of like combining philosophy, economics, and political science has been great. I actually also had a similar question on the Middle East. So I really was interested in your thoughts on the role of internationalism, as you called it, and the EU in a war like what we've seen. Because we won't have the same, but something of that might repeat. And what I wonder is kind of like how you take some of the themes that you described and you think about the present and the future. That would be super interesting to hear. Now, the second thought, maybe for the ending, is actually for the future. The students that now go and study PPE, that go and are interested in influencing political science and going into the government, what do you have to tell them? How do they survive this rocky boat and actually bring some inspiration and bring kind of like the ability to influence societies?
Just explain that people are going to politics or people are going to government?
People are going to study political science in order to enter the government in positions of influence.
I wish I was doing that now. That would be, I mean, what a great time to be studying politics. I mean, there's a young man who was introduced to me, he's 16, he's studying history, economics and theology. He's interested in politics. What a great thing, what a great time to be doing it. I mean, we need people to do that. And I think that whenever people, I mean, this is only said slightly in jest, when people come and say to me, oh, you know, what should I do with my career? I say, look, I'm still looking for advice on my career, and I'm much older than I'm much older than I wish I was. I think that this, maybe bring it back to Isaiah Berlin, the future's not destiny. I mean, there's an awful lot of room for us to make mistakes or get things right. And this point I keep coming back to, there's more resources to do more good than at any time in human history. Actually, life chances for many people around the world are being transformed for the better rather than for the worse, especially women, actually, but not only. And so the aggregate scene and the acute scene are very, 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 very different. And the advice I do give to people is don't see yourself as having to do one thing in your life. Be a multi-sector player. Work in government, work in the NGO sector, work in private sector. We need all those skills. And I always say to people, when government's in retreat, NGOs and the private sector have to step up and be the solution makers, and that's what we're trying to do with the International Rescue Committee. And that's very inspiring. Honestly, I do my job with enthusiasm because I learn something every day. And I might be talking to our team in Gaza, or I might be talking to our research and innovation team, but I learn something. And as long as you're learning, you've got momentum. I mean, I'm not going to... I mean, the only thing I want to say, and I hope it's not... I don't think it crosses a boundary to say this, because I think it goes... I'm not I'm shamefully ill-versed in my own religious heritage. But I do know something about it. And there's this phrase going around at the moment which stands against everything that I believe in as someone who's secular, but the best of what my religious tradition was before, or of my forebears was. And there's this terrible phrase, the tribalization of pain. And the tribalization of pain says that if it's your tribe that is suffering, you care, but if it's not your tribe, it's someone else's problem. And the tradition I was brought up with, which, as I say, was secular, but which I think speaks to the best of the Jewish tradition, is no, we're a human tribe. And if someone else is suffering, whatever their race or their religion or their ethnicity, that's not just their problem, that's our problem. And so, in answer to your question, what can any of us bring to a nightmare like the Middle East on all sides? Let's remember, the tribalization of pain gets us nowhere. And I think that's what I bring to work every day, let me put it that way. And so, whether that speaks to you or not, it's authentic at least.
We'll take a couple of more questions.
Thanks, David. Thank you very much. Back to Britain and Spain. Is that working? How's that? Is that working? Thanks, David, for a wonderful lecture. So you talked about the speed of change and thinking about Britain and the values and attitudes of British people, the pace at which they've been moving, and we've been seeing data recently that shows this group of British young people may be the first, since we ever tracked it over 80 years, that have more regressive values and attitudes than their parents. Any thoughts on how we start to look at that, or particularly in terms of technology policy, and where we might want to go given that pace of change?
That's so hard. So hard to do it at Twitter length as well. First of all, I think we have to be really, really careful. My friend Peter Hyman's just done this amazing project with 16-year-olds around the country. I think 9,000 16-year-olds he's interviewed. And the first thing we can do is all read what he's found, because it's actual real conversation. He's got more data than I've got. And he shows enormous spread, but also challenging of some preconceptions. Secondly, one's inevitably influenced by how one parents one's own teenagers. And so the challenges that are there are enormous. For some reason, my lectures are less attractive than the dopamine hits from social media. And so I think that the challenge of technology policy is enormous. If you want to know where I'm coming from, I'm very much in the Jonathan Haidt, no social media below 16, no iPhones before 14. There's no guarantee in that, because actually we followed that. There's no guarantees in that. But that's obviously not enough. And I think that protecting young people, boys and girls differently and together, is just a massive thing. I would say that's one of the most important jobs in government at the moment. And it deserves to be seen as a great office of state, because you're trying to deal with just something that's so invasive, and there's never been anything quite like that.
Thanks very much. I'm Tulip Siddiq. I'm the local MP here. David, I know Brexit wasn't the main thrust of your lecture, but you did mention it a few times, and it very much still dominates my conversations with my constituents. 87% of my constituency voted to remain, one of the highest in the country, and I still represent 22,000 EU nationals. Even though they can't vote, it is one of the highest in the country. What is your advice about having a closer relationship with the European Union and to minimize the damage of Brexit, knowing full well we're not going back into the European Union? Thanks,
Tulip. I mean, I think that we shouldn't be afraid to tell the truth as we see it. And I'm glad it's not omerta now to talk about Brexit and what it means. No one's trying to relitigate the past. We can't turn the clock back 10 years. We can't refight the referendum from 10 years ago. There's a new Europe being built, as one of the earlier questions said. I think we want to make ourselves part of that discussion, because you can't change geography even if you change political alliances or political institutions. And we're always going to be a European country. I think Ukraine, ironically or interestingly, has reminded people a lot of the role that Britain, the positive role that Britain can play in Europe. And I think we've just got to, I mean, all the stuff to do with, school trips, everything that thickens the relationship is good in my view. And we should just be doing it, not just talking about it. And I wish, I was speaking at a law faculty at one point. Obviously the EU fees have gone up. They were saying it had changed the class discussion. I said, well, raise the money from the law firms to provide bursaries to bring the fee back down, if you're doing that in the interests of your higher education institution. I've really learned this in, this is a nice way to end. This is a good way to end. I really have learned this. When I was in politics, I really honestly believed that hope led to action. That was my gig, really. And I was brought up by that, and I was more of an ideas person than an action person. I thought hope leads to action. I've really learned this running an NGO in some of the toughest places. It's not hope that leads to action, it's action that leads to hope. Do something. People say to me, how do your teams keep hope alive? They're working in the most dire situations. How do they keep going? Well, it's action that leads to hope. I'm not going to say, he who saves a life saves the world, but it's the action that actually drives the sense of purpose and meaning and hope. And I think that's I think that's the way, that would be, I wish I'd thought of that 3 minutes ago and given you a pithier answer, Tulip, but I think I really take that as my learning, that, and when I was, at the end of my time in politics, we created an organization called Movement for Change, which was sort of getting at this. It was an idea that we'd rebuild a Labour Party from the bottom up as well as the top down, rooted in communities, which is of course where the party started. But I think it applies much more broadly, and I've got a much more textured sense of how the action gene is really, really important. And as we think about all of our own individual and collective responsibilities for this sulfurous world around us, I think that makes me quite inspired for the future. Okay.
I'd like now to hand over to Peter Halban, who will make some closing remarks from his family on behalf of Sir Isaiah Berlin, and then to Henry Grunwald as a vote of thanks. Thank you.
Where to begin? It won't be long. David, on behalf of Isaiah's family, we are most deeply grateful for taking personal and professional time to come and address us today. As you guided us through the geopolitical path of Great Britain and the rest of the world, you reminded us of the extreme dangers we face. As you said, Isaiah was devoted to this country for many, many reasons. Above all, for its innate decency, sense of liberty of all sorts, like cholesterol, good and bad, moderation, and morality, which he learnt from Oxford. As you said, Isaiah faced and witnessed both revolutions, including a very disagreeable scene he saw of a man being taken away, and his father said, he will be shot. From that day onwards, he said, I've got to pay attention to humanity. He grew up between the wars. He was in America during the Second World War, to which he always remained devoted. We can't imagine exactly how he would have felt about the world, Britain, the world today. But I do know one thing. He would have enjoyed endless days and hours of discussion with you. And I feel certain that you will be in total sympathy in most of what he said. I'd like to, before giving you something, the other day, you made us very moved to hear that you were a hand behind the last letter that Isaiah ever received. And I thank you for that. He always sat on the fence, but he was a man of liberal centre feeling. And although he died just a few months after the Blair government, your government came in, our government came in, just all of us, he was very optimistic that not only the party, but that England might be on a better path. May I come down and give you one of the most biographical books by Isaiah, who was a person loath to write about himself. It's called Personal Impressions. It was essays on the huge variety of people that he knew, some of which became his closest friends, from Virginia Woolf to Nehemiah, from Roosevelt to Churchill. At the end of the present edition, for the first time, there are a few pages where Isaiah was forced, when he received the Jerusalem Book Fair Prize in 1979, to talk about himself. I will come down and give it to you.
Kvod Harav, distinguished guests, friends all. Over the last 23 years, I've given the majority of the votes of thanks at these lectures. But it's a particular privilege, David, to do it for you tonight, and I'll come back to why in a moment. First of all, thank you all for coming on this cold winter's evening to hear a most fascinating and stimulating lecture from David Miliband. Thank you to everyone at the Hampstead Synagogue who helped to arrange this evening, and particularly to the small group of us led by Zaki, who have managed to keep these lectures going for the last 22 years. It's quite unusual when a memorial lecture is set up in honor of someone for it to not only last as long as this has done, but to have the astonishing range of speakers that we have had, culminating in tonight's bravura performance from you, David. You said that your religious observance, your synagogue attendance had been non-existent. I want to tell you, you're now sitting where a bar mitzvah boy would sit on the day of his bar mitzvah. And I'm not a rabbi, but the rabbi would be here and he'd be giving you words of advice as to how you should live your life in the future. You don't need those words of advice from me. You're not only sitting where a bar mitzvah boy would sit, you're sitting just a few seats away from where the late Sir Isaiah used to sit. And even after he had moved to Oxford, he would certainly come for the Day of Atonement and spend the day sitting here, visibly thinking, if you can understand what I mean by that. It meant a lot to him to be here, and it would have meant a lot to him to have heard you speak so beautifully and brilliantly tonight. It is a privilege to thank you, because when I stepped down from various communal leadership positions in 2009, and I'd had the privilege of working for the Jewish community at a time when you were the Foreign Secretary, You very kindly spoke thanks to me at a small dinner that was arranged to mark that occasion. So it's wonderful that I can now publicly thank you for everything that you have done in your political career and everything that you will go on to do in the future. You said something just now about having had the end of your political career. I think I probably speak for everyone in this room when I say I really hope that that's not the case. You are sorely missed for your vision, for your clarity of thought, and for everything that you've shown yourself, not only as Foreign Secretary, but in the very responsible post you have with the IRC to be able to do. Isaiah Berlin gave a talk in 1957 on political judgment, and he said, what is it to have good judgment in politics? What is it to be politically wise or gifted, to be a political genius, or even to be more than politically competent? And perhaps it's to know how to get things done. And you have shown that you know how to get things done. And I think you left us all with a wonderful thought of the fact that it's action that leads to hope. Without hope, there's no action, but certainly without action, there is no hope at all. So you leave us, having given us an evening of philosophy. You've made us think. I'm always reminded on these occasions of a cartoon I saw several years ago of two women sitting upstairs on a bus and one saying to the other, be philosophical, don't think about it. You have helped us enormously. You've given us so much food for thought, and as Peter has said, the late Sir Isaiah would have welcomed that and would have gone on to talk and think about what you have raised this evening. So on behalf of everyone in our beautiful synagogue tonight, thank you for having agreed to come and give this lecture, and thank you very much for what you have said. We all appreciate it.